this one single message. So after we send this, it will be stored again in a completion variable. We're going to print that completion variable. So here again, we have a nice message from ChatGPT or the API where it sent us back a response. We are only looking at the content this time, so the actual string. And so here we have a nice haiku. All right, so let's pause for a second. And I will answer a few questions. All right, Amir.
Yeah, I have a big picture question. So what we are doing here is basically replicating what we would do in the chat, right?
Yes, perfect.
What is the end goal of this? So this is, I mean, I can't imagine that this on its own would be a necessarily useful exercise, because we could just have this conversation with the chat, right? So why would you want to turn it into a code like this?
I love that question. Thank you for asking. So here, in this case, this is very much introductory. So it is how you use specifically the completions API, very specifically. Like that is what we are talking about in these code cells. But here, this is when you'll see what we do around using this API. So we love the API. It's exciting. All it does for us, which is exciting, no, is that it gives us a response from an LLM based on however we want it to behave. So if we wanted to have a different temperature, if we wanted to have a different model or token length that it sends back, if we want to look at the log probabilities, any of those things that we want are accessible through the API. And that's what we're looking at now. But we want to put it into something. So even if we think about like Amplify, for example, like that has some lines in there that if they were using directly this API, that would look like client.chat.completions.create. It would look just like this, except for the process of automating the addition of these different lines, it would be automated. It would be programmatic. We are doing it very, very manually now, so we understand the structure of what we need to be doing to interact with this API. But there is programming, substantial programming outside of this to make it into the platform that you actually want. So for example, Amplify has a completely different user interface. With ChatGPT, we are constrained to that very specific interface that they have. With Amplify, they have backing of different databases that have different kinds of data that may or may not be proprietary in some sense, or sensitive data that they can access. We could never put that information into ChatGPT. And so that is the programmatic nature. This very specifically is the one function that we use in order to get a response from the LLM. But that is just a tiny piece of what we actually need to do in the full scope of creating an application. Is that not okay? You're good. All right, next question. Shu.
Okay, I'm wondering, does the completion dot choices always has one element in it?
I love, y'all are asking some good questions that I absolutely love. Okay, so I will just tell you the answer, although this is something that we will explore in the future. So I'm going to briefly go back to this API reference. So this is platform.openai.com. If we go to the API reference, and the specific API that we're using is the chat reference, this is what we've been using the entire time. You can see that we have always sent a model. Sorry, I'm just going to roll back. This is the model parameter that we sent. We have always sent messages because it's required. You see here, messages. But there are so many other parameters that we could send. And again, we'll explore this a little bit more in just a second. One of those parameters is this N. What that N is, that you can't see on my screen, is how many chat completion choices to generate for each input message. What we see here in the API is N defaults to 1. So when we do not change that parameter in that default API call that we are making, it automatically fills in N with 1, which is why we get just one choice. If we were to instead set N to be like 15, which I don't even know if we can do that, but if we send it to 15, we would instead have an array of 15 choices. And so if you use Gemini, it used to be, I'm not sure if they have this now, but if you use Gemini, they used to have this like nice array of choices. Like it would give you like it would like show you the first choice, but then it'll give you like some other like response choices to choose from. Delightful. The same thing is possible with OpenAI. You just set this parameter in the API call so that you have more than one choice.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. All right. All right. So that's sounding good. And actually, the next thing that we're going to go into is more about APIs generally. So you can understand what it is that we're looking at. Also, the answer to that question about N, this is sort of another reason that we like the programmatic access, because it gives us so much flexibility in what we can actually ask for. So with ChatGPT, I have not witnessed where you can have multiple choices to choose from. I saw that in Gemini and I loved it. But programmatically, we can make a user interface that does that. All right, then. So now let's talk just a little bit more about APIs. And I just need to pause my sharing right quick because I accidentally closed my other. All right, there we go. I tell you, having a bunch of windows is exciting, but it is a little bit rough during presentations. All right. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about APIs, because I think, and can you see a slide, like a slideshow right now? Okay,
Yeah.
great. So, because I know some people are out there like, oh, she keeps saying APIs. What is that? Like, I don't even know what you're talking about. Totally okay. We're going to talk about it now. So what is an API? Very basically, we can think about an API as being a contract between developers and a particular service. When we're talking about a service, when we're talking about a service, we can think about something like OpenAI. It provides that chat completions API that we've been using. It provides other APIs like for image access, for assistance. There are lots of different APIs that it has, but then we can think more generally about even things that you use in Python. So like pandas, you might consider pandas to have an API, NumPy, all of these things. What they have are these contracts. What are the contracts? Basically, the developer, it wants to be able, we want to be able to do something, and this service is able to provide that something. So we want to be able to use the service programmatically. The service will say, yeah, okay, got you. We have this functionality. We have an API. We have created an API so that you can use this, but there are some factors that we need to agree upon. One is that when you use my service, I want to know who you are. And so we have already experienced this at great length. When it wants to know who you are, what we're talking about is that API token or API key. That is associated with your account and also with your funds. When you are using specific services, it always wants to be able to track what you're doing, log what you're doing, make sure that you actually have the right to access certain services. Maybe you're at, an intro level, or you're not at the premium level. That means your API key should not be able to access certain things. That's one of the rules of most services. Now, when you get to general things like Python, Pandas, NumPy, all that stuff, not so much. But a real true service like OpenAI, Gemini, you will always find that you have to make an API key so that very specific service can know who is using their platform and what they are able to access. A second thing about services is they don't speak every language. So we saw this when we looked a little bit more at the API. We saw that the API supports Python, Node, and some Bash. There are lots of other languages out there. Java, C++, C#. It doesn't do those. So it doesn't have an API implemented in those languages, but it does provide a Python API, and we are using the Python API very specifically. Also, all APIs, the contracts, what there are it really is just a fundamental set of rules. API will say, all right, I offer these specific things, these specific functions, this specific functionality. If you want to use it, you have to provide me something in particular, and I will provide you something in particular. So we'll look a little bit more about what those rules look like in a second. And also they have a fee. So we're seeing this with ChatGPT right now. If you go to your billing page, you will see a difference in the money that has been spent. Okay, so delightful. And also when I'm talking about rules, I'm not really talking about, because there are rules. So there are things about appropriate use of the service, like you can't, I don't know, infringe upon whatever rights, but then there are the rules of the actual API language. And so we saw some of those rules actually 1 second ago on platform.openai.com, but now let's look at them a little bit more generally. So let's say that we have an API service or an API at all. So we'll think OpenAI. The rules that it has created is that 1, I have this functionality that's called create circle. And 2, I have this functionality that's called create square. Those are the 2 functions that I offer, just those. You can create a circle or you can create a square. If you want to create a circle, you need to pass in this green square. I only accept a green square. If you send me a red square, no. You will send me a green square if you want to create circle. In exchange, the API service will give you this yellow circle. So what have we said here? API service has 2 rules. One of those rules is create circle. The other one is create square. If you want to use create circle, the developer needs to pass in this green square because that is what the API expects. And what the API service will return is this yellow circle. So the developer should not expect to get a red circle. They should not expect to get a blue smiley face. They should expect to get a yellow circle. For create square, we have the functionality to create a square, but what the developer or what the API wants to receive is it wants to receive, a complex set of symbols, which we sometimes see. Sometimes the things that you need to pass in is relatively complex, like a lightning bolt, question mark shape, and a sun. And you need to pass in all 3 and in this order. Those are the rules for sending data to create square if you want to get back your yellow square. So let's look at some examples. Let's say that you're a developer. In these cases, you want to create a circle. In these cases, you want to create a square. And in these cases, you want to create a rectangle. So here we want to create a rectangle, or a circle. And so for this case specifically, we call create circle and we send it a green circle. Well, the API is going to receive that. It says, all right, I do create circle. I have been sent this green square. And then so what I will return is this yellow circle. Everything is great. Everything is perfect because those are the contractual rules between the API and the developer. Now, let's say you want to create a circle. You send create circle, but instead you send the parameter purple square. When the API receives this, you'll get back an error because what it wanted was a green square. So there's something wrong with this parameter that you've sent. You'll probably get a message that's like, I received a square, but it's the wrong color purple. expected green or something like that. Here we have another case where we're still trying to create a circle. We call it the right name, create circle, but we send this smiley face instead, still the wrong parameter format for what it wanted to receive. It wanted to receive this green square. All you get is an error response. So now let's look at cases when we want to create a square. So now we're interacting with this service and we call create circle. Maybe we copy and pasted wrong like I did earlier today. And so we have the wrong information. Unfortunately, we call the wrong function, but we do pass in all the right inputs. Very exciting times. This is still incorrect because what the API will see is that you wanted to create a circle. It was expecting a square and you gave it this craziness. Let's look at this case. Still trying to create a square. You send it the request to create a square. So you call it this functionality, the right name. You send in the right order. You send in the right colors. You send in all of the right shapes. Of course, we would expect this to work. And in return, what we will be given is this yellow square as expected. Now let's say that we're still trying to create a square. We send in this set of inputs. What do you think will happen? So let's get a green check if you think it'll work, red X if you think it won't work. All right, for red X's, anyone want to unmute and say why they think it won't work?
First off, the order is wrong,
Yep.
and second off, the blue symbol is rotated, so it's not exactly correct.
Yep. Perfect. So one, we have the order wrong. Let's say the model has a very specific order of things that it wants to receive. Often this is like not really the case in Python because you can use keywords, maybe the first few parameters. But the order is incorrect. It specifically wanted to receive arrow, question mark shape, sun. You gave it lightning bolt. Is that what I just said? Lightning bolt, sun, rotated question mark shape. So sometimes what happens is you generally kind of get things like a little bit right. So you got that it was supposed to have like this shape, but maybe you got your parameters in a little bit of the wrong order, or you called them a little bit of the wrong key name. Like I almost called a key user instead of role. Maybe that's what, the wrong thing that I put in. In this case, you're still going to get an error response. Again, if order matters, you must use the order that they want, and you have to pass in the parameters in the format that they expect. So here, lastly, let's say that the developer wants to create a rectangle. Now we try to just, I don't know why we would just create this function, this random name that's not in the API, but maybe we will, maybe we do. And so we call create rect. Perfect parameters. You might think to yourself, well, a rectangle, squares and rectangles are related, so why not? So of course this won't work because it's not in the set of rules that API is offering. So briefly, I do want to go over some other situations that you might find yourself in when you are communicating with the OpenAI API. Briefly, you can do everything right sometimes, and it seems like things are great. Like I've run this code 1,000 times before, it should run again today. There are cases in which that will not be the case. So for example, we have all of our correct formatting for these cases. If you receive an error back, hopefully it is a descriptive error. And that's again why we like OpenAI, because it sends us good descriptive errors. Sometimes your code won't run even though it's perfect because either your authentication is wrong, so you haven't put in the API key, you've put in your API key incorrectly, or you don't have any funds to be able to pay for that API access. And sometimes you will get an error because of that. You will get an error because of that. Other times you can do everything right. sometimes it's just the case that in the actual documentation, there is an error in how it's written. And so, I mean, documentation is written by people, and also APIs update like rapidly, especially this day and age, and especially with LLMs to enhance like code creation. So sometimes there is just a documentation in the error in the documentation, which means that maybe although create circle, like it's just not working because the documentation is just written it incorrectly. Also, there are cases where if you run something yesterday and run it today on platforms like Google Colab, where you're not directly always in control of that underlying set of packages that is available, sometimes what happens is the API will update right under you, and the function that worked yesterday will not work today because they've updated that function. I bring this up very specifically because LangChain, which is what we'll be using tomorrow, LangChain has a version update, a major version update coming, I think, this week, and we're using LangChain. So if something is working yesterday, but not today, it could just be because the API updated and they've changed the way that that function behaves. So let's try not to find ourselves in that situation. And that's kind of up to me. So we'll see if it happens. All right. So also sometimes you can do things right. And what you would expect in terms of create circle as a developer, if you've seen this, send this green square, is that you would receive a yellow circle back. Sometimes the API will respond with things that you don't expect. So like an orange circle instead of a yellow circle. And again, sometimes if you have a version update or the API updates, the code itself works correctly, but what they have changed is how it responds or the kind of response that it sends. So you might find that you get this orange circle instead. Other things that can happen is that sometimes you're able to send these additional parameters alongside of what the documentation actually says. And for whatever reason it works and you get back something else that maybe that you wanted to modify. Sometimes it's that there's the case that there are undocumented parameters in the API documentation. So whenever you're looking online at the website, the API reference, the tutorial documentation, nothing ever mentions this, but you're able to send this. Usually people find these parameters through looking at the source code and just realizing that it's something that they can use, although the documentation has not been updated in order to be able to actually use those parameters. Or sorry, to actually reflect that those parameters could be used. All right. So questions about generally APIs. All right, well, it's that time. So I think we have about 15 minutes left. We are going to start using this API. We're going to start using the technical API reference. So let us do that. I'll send you this link in the chat. And actually, I think I'm going to side by side it. Hope it doesn't want to do that. We're going to move. All right, we'll put that one there, put that one there, make this a little bit smaller. And we'll remove this. Sorry, we moved there. Let me get back. Shouldn't have collapsed that because now I can't navigate the way that I want. Yeah, can't get the sidebar. Okay. Sorry, I'm out here struggling, man. Umang, do you happen to have the direct? Here, let me. I'm just gonna go ahead and put that back. All right, there we go. We made it. We made it. We struggled, but we made it. Okay. So here now we're going to start trying to use the completions API directly. So this is chat completions. This is chat completions. It's one of the many APIs that are available. So what we're going to do is we are going to abstract away from how we have previously been looking at these messages. This right here, again, it's just a list. We can define the list outside of where we pass in the information. So here, that's what we're going to do. We have this list that we've defined. We have a system message, which is being a fantastic storyteller. They tell long, detailed stories. And the first message that we're going to send is we're going to ask for a story about a cat who hides when nails need to be cut. So these are the messages. And here you start to see this development of how programming looks versus how using the API looks. So here again, we have our chat completions.create. This is the same thing that we had before, still passing in the same model. Now we're passing in the messages, but we're passing it in using this that we've already created. So that looks a little different, but it's the same exact functionality. And what we're going to do first is we're going to examine how we can limit the number of tokens that are returned by the API. So what we do is we casually come over to the API, create chat completion, and we just see if there's any functionality that's available that can help us to do this. As it were, there's a parameter called max tokens. Max tokens is an integer or null, and it's optional. Optional is basically meaning that you see how we haven't passed that in. We also don't have to. So what we can do is use this max tokens parameter, keeping in mind that it's an integer. And so what we're going to do is just add this to the list of the parameters that we have already sent or have already specified. So here, we're just going to add max tokens, and we're just going to set that to be a number. I mean, let's see what number. We can make it short. We can make it long. Actually, we're going to explore what it means to be null. So if we want it to be null, what we can do is set this parameter to be none and see how this behaves when max tokens is actually null, or sorry, null up here. So let's run this one. You can see its little arrow executing, attempting to get a response, taking a little bit of time. Here you can see the model dump, so it's a little bit more formatted. And here you see this really long thing because actually the system prompt is that should be long, right? So we have this story that we requested. We see that the assistant is responding, and we see that this is the actual story that is responded. Something else that is in this entire structure of the response is the finish reason. So this becomes interesting when you start limiting the maximum number of tokens. So let's see how we can access that and see how it changes if we do limit the maximum number of tokens. Because again, we just set it to be none, and probably that is the maximum. So the name of our variable up here is full token completion. That is where the output of our completion is stored. And I'm just going to scroll down off of that. So full token completion. We know that the next thing we need to access is choices. We know that we actually only have one option, and we pick the 0th one. And so in that 0 with choice, what we can actually access is this key, finish reason. So finish reason. Shift enter, we run that, and we see that the finish reason for a request where we passed in essentially none is stop. So stop is meaning that it ran the whole way and then it was just like done, so it stopped. So now let's modify this parameter, the max tokens. Now we'll change it to something other than the null, which is what it would likely be. And let's go ahead and set that to be 20. So we're using the same conversation messages that we had before. You saw that we did not update the conversation. So it is actually the same exact conversation that we had at the beginning. No change, no turn update. And what we're doing is experimenting with the difference between that original one and this one, keeping everything constant other than the number of maximum tokens. So here, before we set it to be none, now we're going to set it to be 20. We're going to save this response into max token completion, and we're going to look at that response. So here we can run this. You see that here is actually the entire content. Much shorter. You can see here that the completion tokens, so this is the usage, by the way. It's also part of the return data structure from OpenAI from a request. This is the number of tokens that were generated in the completion part. So not the prompt, but the completion. So this right here, once upon a time, blah, 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 blah. This is 20 tokens, which tracks because that's what we asked for as a maximum. In our prompt that we sent, so those system message and user message, that had 59 tokens. And then in totality, the entire thing that was returned has 79 tokens, or the entire set of messages, like the entire conversation is 79 tokens. The reason that this is nice is pretty much because it helps you to keep track of how much you are spending if you choose to use it that way. And again, this is another reason why we love programmatic access to ChatGPT, because we can start using things like this to ensure that some of our users aren't just burning up the entire platform, spending exorbitant money. We can limit certain things. So what we saw is that max tokens, it actually doesn't shorten, like it doesn't constrain how the model responds. What it does is that it just kind of cuts it off. So it didn't tell a very short story. It told the same story, but it only sent you 20 tokens of it. And so that is something to know. So now this is written for you just to look into the finished reason. Here we see that this is different than what we had before. This is the length parameter. This says length, meaning that, hey, I stopped, not because I stopped and I was finished, but because you told me I could only use 20 tokens and I reached those 20 tokens, and so it's over. So here we can see that we have a different response from ChatGPT because it ended differently. Now, I am realizing that we have just 4 minutes left, but this is something that I think that you need to see. So I'm going to try and run through it really quick. If I can make sure that I can access this sidebar. Okay, let me see if I can do it, because honestly, I need this entire page. I need the example Python code on the side. Nope. Well, people, I'm gonna have to fill up the whole page if it will let me. Y'all, I'm having a hard time today. All right. So what we're going to do, and if you can't make it in, I mean, you can also just watch, is maybe when we get to this website, what we see in this reference are all of these like really cool, different little, things that we can do. So here we might be like, oh my gosh, image input, let me try that. So maybe what we do is copy and paste that. And we come back to Colab. And we paste that in as a first exploration into what to do. Okay, so we're super excited. We're pumped. We're like, oh my gosh, the API documentation, like it came right from there. Like we're feeling really confident. Here we see a slightly different configuration of the messages because we've always seen role user with some content, but we have never seen content like this. what we are doing here is we are sending a message, which is based on an image. And we are asking things about that image. So here the content has two parts. There is a text part where we say, hey, what's in this image? And then there is sort of an image part. As an image URL, we send the actual image. So then in that, what the completion looks like is answering a question about the image. So in our minds, we're like super excited. We are so pumped. We like want to make it happen. And so what we do, I'm just going to call this image response, is we run this. We're super excited. So pumped. Then we have a moment of absolute terror because literally with our eyes, we just saw that we copied and pasted. What we do in that case is, one, we make sure that we copied and pasted correctly, but then we look at what exactly is wrong. It's saying wrong input, something is wrong. It tries to specify it. It tries to say, hey, don't send me green light, don't send me yellow lightning, send me green lightning. And it's trying to tell you that in its little OpenAI words. So at this point, what you do when you run into situations like this is you look really well, you say, all right, there's something wrong with the message. It wanted an object, which basically means something that's dictionary-ish, but it got a string. Something about this image URL, something is wrong with it. So what we do in that case is we're going to come back to the API. We're going to look at messages. We're going to look at all of the types. What we're using is a user message. We're going to look at it a little bit more. We're going to try to figure out what's wrong with it. We're going to look at content because it was telling us that something is wrong with the content. We're going to look really, really well at this. And we're like, all right, I have text and image URL. And then we're going to look at the image part because we're confused. And so what we see is that the way that this is passed in is incorrect. So we need to have the type of the content part and the image URL instead of just the image URL. So you can see that in the solutions where it has been updated. And so it's this thing right here. It was telling us that that was a string. What it really wanted was something that looks a lot more like a dictionary. And you can see that response in the solutions. So, all right, I know we had a packed day. It was really intense because we learned how to use Colab. At the same time, we're using OpenAI. At the same time, we're using APIs. But we will talk more tomorrow. There is homework. Make sure to do it. It'll give you depth and experience on the things that we talked about today. Go through the rest of the cells of the notebook so that you will be able to explore a little bit more, see how things look like as applications, and also try out what actual applications look like. All right, we are going to casually move into office hours. If you have any other questions, we are happy to answer.